Good evening, and welcome to Politics in Prose. My name is Andrew Riblett, and I'm one of the event staffers here. For those of you who don't know, Politics in Prose hosts many events that are two branches at the Wharf and Union Market, as well as this location, which has been here for over 35 years. At this point, we host close to 1,000 authors a year, so if you're a relative newcomer, welcome, and we'd love to have you for some more events. Print calendars for 2020 are available at our information desk, as well as our website. To start things off tonight, we ask that you please silence your cell phones. We are audio recording and video recording this event, and we'd hate for there to be ringing sounds interrupting that recording. And since there will be time for your questions in the back half of the program, and so that those questions are captured on the recording, please come up to the standing microphone, and please do keep your question a question. That's best for keeping the conversation flowing and allowing for more time for folks to step up to the mic. Then, after the talk, you'll find many copies of tonight's book behind our registers, so grab a copy or two, and then you can meet us back here for the book signing. Before you do that, we'd love for you to fold up your chairs, which would be a huge help in putting the store back in place post-event. Tonight, it's my honor to introduce Allan Lichtman. Allan Lichtman is a distinguished professor of history at American University and the author of many acclaimed books on U.S. political history, including White Protestant Nation, The Rise of the American Conservative Movement, which is a finalist for the National Book Critics Circle Award, FDR and the Jews with Richard Breitman, and The Case for Impeachment, as well as The Keys to the White House, a system for predicting U.S. elections. He is regularly sought out by the media for his authoritative views on voting and elections. Now for the book. Examining the failed strategies of the gun control movement, Lichtman argues that the only way to control the country's rampant gun violence is by repealing the Second Amendment. Drawing on the nation's history of firearms and gun regulations, legal theory, and statistics, Lichtman traces the amendment to a once-forgotten sentence in the Constitution, exposes the gun lobby's distortion of the past, and shows how we can make America safer even without taking guns away from those who currently have them. Please help me welcome Allan Lichtman.
Thank you. I hate to disappoint you, but I'm not going to predict the results of the next election tonight. Politics in Prose would have to pay me a lot more to get that result. But I will talk about my new, by the way, all I ever do in successfully predicting elections since 1984 is make half of the country really, really mad at me. And since last time I predicted both Donald Trump's election and his impeachment, I got the whole country really, really mad at me. But I guarantee, with this new book, Repeal the Second Amendment, I'll have plenty of people really, really mad at me. So I'm going to talk for a little while, and then I'll take any and all of your questions. Ask me anything about the Second Amendment, gun control, anything about politics and history. Don't ask me about the opera, and we'll get along really, really well. And please don't make speeches. You'll have your own time to do that. Sadly, this is not a fun topic, but it is, I think, one of the most important issues we face as individuals and we face as a nation. You heard Donald Trump the other night say, while I am president, I'm going to protect your Second Amendment rights. Well, that, of course, is a euphemism for what? Doing absolutely nothing to make any of us safer from gun violence in America. He's been president for 3 years. Promised after every massacre to do something about it and never has done a darn thing. Now, I'm going to take you back very sadly to August of last year. A gunman in Dayton, Ohio, armed with a semi-automatic rifle, killed 9 people and wounded 17 in 36 seconds. Not 36 minutes, 36 seconds. In that flicker of time, barely enough to bat an eyelash, the gunman in Dayton killed more people than were murdered. In fact, killed 3 times more people than were murdered in the entire nation of Japan for the entire year Japan is a huge country, almost a third of the size of the United States. And I will repeat that. In 36 seconds of violence in Dayton, a gunman murdered 3 times as many persons as were killed the entire year in the country of Japan. Japan, like our nation, suffers from mental illness, drug addiction, poverty, violent video games. So what is the difference? Japan has perhaps the world's tightest gun controls, and we have the loosest of any democratic country. To listen to the gun lobby and their arguments for virtually no gun controls to let everyone have an unlimited access to arms, you would think America is the safest country of peer democracies. You saw how obviously absurd that was, comparing America to Japan. And of course, mass murders, like those in Dayton, are the tip of the iceberg of gun violence in America. Gun murders claim approximately 15,000 lives per year in the United States. The United States is not the safest of peer democracies, but the least safe by an enormous margin. Take our closest peer nations, the other nations in the G7 group of nations, plus Australia. This is places like Canada, Britain, France, Italy, Germany, Japan, Australia. An American is 20 times more likely per capita, per person, to be murdered by a gun than the resident of those peer democracies. Not 20% more likely, 20 times more likely than those other nations which all have much tighter gun controls. But very, very sadly, gun murders do not even come close to tallying up the toll of gun violence in America. 15,000 gun murders, more than 23,000 gun suicides in the United States. And guns are directly related to suicide. Most suicides are decided very quickly, and it is only through a gun that you can instantly, impulsively attempt to commit suicide. Guns are 90% lethal compared to 2% for poisoning or slashing your wrists or other parts of your body. 23,000 plus gun suicides in America. Again, look at our peer nations. An American is 7 times more likely to commit suicide by a gun than residents of our peer democracies in the G7 group of nations in Australia. Again, that's not 7%, that's 7 times. Now compare that to non-gun suicides. An American is 40% less likely to commit suicide by other means than residents of our peer democracies. Guns make the difference. Now, when I set out to write a book on repealing the Second Amendment to make America safer from gun violence, I have to tell you, that was not popular among my friends and family. They said, don't write this book. They said, you're playing right into the hands of the gun lobby, who has always claimed the gun control movement wants to repeal the Second Amendment and take away your guns. But I said it's a book that must be written. The gun lobby has gone nowhere in a quarter of a century. In fact, it slid backwards. The last big national gun control measure was the assault weapons ban of 1994. And guess what happened to that? It lapsed in 2004 and no longer exists, even though mass murders by semi-automatic weapons were much lower during the period of the critical assault weapons ban. So we've had a movement that's gone nowhere in the past 25 years. Why? It's not the spending of the NRA. That's a myth. The NRA spends a drop in the bucket compared to the amount of money that goes in to our politics. It's not the lobbying of the NRA. Other groups, the Chamber of Commerce, by huge factors, outweigh NRA lobbies. The real issue, and the one that the gun control movement must take on, is the Second Amendment. It is the Second Amendment, as you heard the other night from the President of the United States, that justifies the opposition even to the most reasonable forms of gun control. And the strategy of the gun control movement that has failed for so many years is a strategy of playing not to lose rather than a strategy of playing to win. The fundamental argument of the gun control movement is we support the Second Amendment, but we also support reasonable gun controls. Do you think for one moment that fools anyone who's part of the gun lobby or influenced by the gun lobby? All they do is call the gun control people hypocrites. It doesn't inspire the kind of grassroots movement that we need. We have never seen in this country a movement that fails so badly with 70 and 80% public support for its particular measures, like universal background checks. But the strategy is a failed one. The game needs to be changed. And what I've tried to do in this book is not just inspire people interested in having a safer country where maybe we won't have 3 gun murders a year like Japan, but if we were like other countries, instead of 15,000 gun murders a year, we might have 1,000 gun murders a year. Instead of 23,000 suicides, might have 2,000 suicides. Tens of thousands of lives can be saved each year, but the game needs to be changed. And I've tried to provide the historical arguments and the strategic guidance for a very different approach to the gun control movement. Here's the dirty little secret behind the gun lobby. America lived comfortably for some 200 years with a Second Amendment that had no role in gun control and no role in public policy. Until 2010, federal courts had not struck down a single of hundreds and hundreds of gun control legislation in America. Not struck down a single law based upon the Second Amendment, because the Second Amendment was understood in this way. This is from a 1955 memo by a constitutional expert. Quote, from all the direct and indirect evidence, the Second Amendment appears to apply to a collective, not an individual right to bear arms. Who do you think wrote that? Some gun control advocate? No. That was written by the in-house constitutional expert for guess what organization? The National Rifle Association. 20 years later, in 1975, the National Rifle Association handbook said the Second Amendment has, quote, limited practical utility, unquote, in combating gun control. What happened? There were no new discoveries. Constitution didn't change. Statements of the framers didn't change. But something happened at the NRA. In 1977, 2 years after the fact book, there was a revolution. Some called it the Revolution in Cincinnati because it occurred at the NRA annual meeting in Cincinnati, in which a new militant leadership took over the NRA and made the strategic decision that we are going to oppose any kind of gun control measure, and we are going to oppose it by an absolutist interpretation of the NRA. by the NRA of the Second Amendment. Never mind what the NRA had concluded earlier. We are now going to hijack the Second Amendment and distort it to make the phony claim that it supports an unlimited private right to bear arms. And by the way, the NRA doesn't care who gets the arms, as long as the arms are sold and their financial supporters in the gun industry make profits. They're willing that anyone can get arms. Gangbangers, drug dealers, people prone to suicide, domestic abusers. Last year, and this is astounding, and very few people know this, the NRA furiously lobbied against the Violence for Women Act. Why? Because the act included a measure to keep guns out of the hands of domestic abusers who kill and wound many thousands of women each year. Having guns around doesn't help women to self-defense. You are far more likely to be killed or injured by a gun than to use it in self-defense. So this is how the NRA hijacked the Second Amendment. And they paid for a whole cadre of scholars to change what had been the prevailing interpretation. In fact, historically, America has a rich and extended tradition of gun controls. Going all the way back into the colonial era, virtually every colony had some kind of gun control measures. And then when the Second Amendment was adopted, not a single person, not a single figure involved in the framing or passage of the Second Amendment said that it protected an individual right to keep and bear arms. You can't find it. And the gun lobby can't find it either. So what they do is fabricate things. My favorite fabrication is a quote that circulates all over the gun lobby. It's by Thomas Jefferson, and he talks about the critical need for arms. Sounds like something very much in support of the NRA's interpretation of the Second Amendment. But you know what Jefferson was really talking about in that letter? He wasn't talking about arming yourself with guns. He was talking about arming yourself with facts. He wrote to one of his contemporaries, "Please send me these letters that you have in my possession so I will have the facts to deal with my political opponents who are attacking me." Not a single founder or framer said it protected an individual right to bear arms. And of course, you know, the first clause of the Second Amendment talks about the need for securing a well-regulated militia. And a whole panel of linguists, historians, and professors of English have said the clear understanding of contemporaries at the time was that the first clause about a well-regulated militia guides the second clause about the right to keep and bear arms. They're not separable. It's not just a preamble. And that was the interpretation until the NRA hijacked it in the late 20th century. Scholars have reviewed millions of scanned documents. They're all digitized from the constitutional and early republic era. Things like newspapers, congressional debates, diaries, letters. 99.9% of those references to bear arms referred to the military use of arms. There was almost never a reference to the use of arms for self-defense or any private purpose. My favorite source is a book by a gun lobby enthusiast, Clayton Kramer. He wrote about guns in the early America, and his very purpose was to say, guns are ubiquitous, they're harmless, they're as American as apple pie. And he cites gun accidents, he cites wars. How many examples in the entire period of self-defense with firearms do you think he cites? Zero. The word self-defense isn't even in his index. Why? because at the time the Constitution was framed, firearms were useless for self-defense. They were big, unwieldy. They misfired. They were incredibly hard to aim. In fact, the first gun violence trial in the early republic, 1799, a figure was prosecuted for brandishing a gun, and his defense said, he shouldn't be prosecuted. Guns are harmless. They don't work. If you really wanted to do violence, get a dirk, kind of a short-handled sword. Get a sword, but a gun? Forget it. It doesn't amount to anything. And here's the thing. Here is what I think. It's not, very flattering to the framers, but here's what I think is the utterly decisive argument as to why the framers could not possibly, conceivably, remotely have meant the Second Amendment to guarantee an unlimited right to bear and keep private arms. Who's the framer of the Second Amendment, the father of the Constitution? James Madison, right? What state was James Madison from? Virginia. And what did James Madison hold? Slaves. Do you think for one moment slaveholder James Madison and all those other slaveholders who ran the other southern states and all those bigots in the North who thought black people were inferior, for 1 second would have supported an amendment that gave free black people in America the right to keep and bear arms? Of course not. Not for a moment. But by having the right to bear arms only for the purpose of a well-regulated militia, that kept arms out of the hands of black people, serving the interests of James Madison and the rest of the South. You know why it kept arms out of the hands of black people? They could not legally serve in the militia. Only white people could serve in the militia. And by the way, if the NRA was right, not only would the Second Amendment, with all these old Federalists having given black people, heaven forbid, the right to keep and bear arms, who else would it have given the right to bear arms? Women! They wouldn't even let women vote because they thought they were too dependent and too weak. Do you think for a moment they would have supported an amendment that would have given women, who are often, beaten around by their husbands, the right to have arms? Forget it. It's just not in any way plausible. And this was where the Second Amendment stood until hijacked by the NRA in the late 20th century. And today, the NRA is a racket. Dwight Eisenhower. Anyone remember or read about, I'm actually almost old enough to remember, Dwight Eisenhower's farewell address? Remember what he warned against? The military-industrial complex, right? The iron triangle of defense contractors, members of Congress, and the military. Well, we have the military firearms, or the firearms industry complex, and a new iron triangle, right? It's the gun makers, the gun lobby, financed by the gun makers, and all of the politicians who think that they benefit from it. And until we follow the lead of the late Justice John Paul Stevens, who was the one who inspired me to do this when he wrote an op-ed 2 years ago about repealing the Second Amendment, until we forthrightly take on the Second Amendment, we are never going to break the iron triangle of the firearms industrial complex and the way in which they have this country stitched up to the detriment of the lives and well-being of so many Americans every single year. And as I said, the NRA has become a racket. You know how much its CAO makes? $1.4 million. This is supposedly for a nonprofit educational organization. Second in command makes $1.2 million. Way out of line for a nonprofit Even the president of American University doesn't make anything close to that, I can assure you. Half a dozen or more people make north of $600,000. They get all this money in from their members who they think is going to support the members' goals. It's going into the pockets of the leaders. And you best believe none of that money trickles down to the ordinary employees who are very poorly paid by the NRA. Not only that, NRA has a foundation. And foundations are supposed to be separate from groups that engage in politics. But every year, the NRA Foundation pours millions of dollars into the NRA. And you know why that's so incredible? Because if you contribute to a charitable foundation, what can you do with that contribution? At least until Trump put a limit on it. Deduct it. So you get these charitable contributions flowing into the foundation, which then flow into the political arm of the operation, the National Rifle Association. Now, another reason many people have asked me not to write this book. I can't tell you, the blowback I got here. Come on, Lichtman. Repeal the Second Amendment. You're this crazy, pie in the sky idealist. Never going to happen. And I say, be careful about criticizing my predictions. They've been pretty good over the years. And you know what? 20 years ago, 25 years ago, if I had told you a conservative Supreme Court was going to declare that gay marriage is a constitutional right, you would have had me committed somewhere. Impossible. Can never happen. That's got 20% support. Well, it did happen, and now gay marriage is supported by 2/3 of Americans. I went to Brandeis University, and the great late Justice Louis Brandeis said, some of the things most worth doing in this world seemed impossible at the time. And you know what? There is a precedent for repealing a constitutional amendment. Anyone know what that was? Prohibition. Passed in 1919, repealed in 1933. And guess what the smart money at the time said about the chances of repealing prohibition? 0. Never going to happen. And it did. And it can happen. It happened for the same reasons why it can't happen for the Second Amendment. Because prohibition, which when it was passed, it was believed to make everyone safer, right? We're going to get rid of all this drunkenness, this drinking, all of this mayhem. And did it make people safer? No. It started bootlegging and organized crime and, culminated in the St. Valentine's Day Massacre. By the way, how many people were killed in the St. Valentine's Day Massacre? 7. We routinely now have massacres in America that kill more than 7 people. Some of them kill dozens of people. And we've almost become inured to it. Like we've become inured to Donald Trump's lies. There are so many of them. You just can't, imagine that. One of my favorite quotes is from The Onion, the satirical magazine, and it says, "We can't do anything about mass murders, says the one country where they regularly happen." It's, and they're happening every single day. We have a mass murder, and we don't even notice them anymore. They don't even make headlines. They just kind of wash over us. It's just incredible. So the reason the Prohibition Amendment was repealed was because it proved counterproductive, just like the Second Amendment is proving counterproductive. It's not giving us anything, but it's taking a lot away. Now, the gun lobby will also tell you there's another reason for the Second Amendment besides, having everybody be armed, and that is to give citizens the right to rise up and arm rebellion against our country. Sure. Anything about the Federalists, the staid law and order Federalists who framed the Second Amendment? Do you think for 1 second their purpose was to give people weapons so they could rise up against their lawful government? Forget it. If you believe that, I've got a really big bridge to send you in my hometown of Brooklyn. Of course not. In fact, in the administrations of George Washington and John Adams, What did they muster under the Second Amendment the militia to do? Put down internal rebellions. The Whiskey Rebellion and the Freeze Rebellion. The last thing that they contemplated was an amendment that would give people weaponry so that they could rise up against their government. And by the way, while the repeal of prohibition is most obvious, it's not the only way in which our Constitution has been fundamentally changed. Under the original Constitution, do you know how you became vice president? There was no separate vote for vice president. You were the second highest vote getter in the Electoral College became vice president, even if it was, an opponent of the president. That wasn't changed until the 12th Amendment that created the modern ticket system. You know how U.S. senators were originally selected? By state legislatures. That wasn't changed until the early 20th century when we got popular voting. So there have been lots of constitutional fundamental changes that people thought were, of course, impossible. Now, even if a repeal movement does not succeed in repealing the amendment, my argument is also it'll create the grassroots enthusiasm, the movement for gun control. Now, the NRA will tell you, Lichtman wants to take away your guns, right? Wrong. No one's guns were confiscated during the 200-plus years when the Second Amendment was interpreted only for collective defense through a well-regulated militia. And none of the common sense reforms that I outline in the book that would make us so much safer have anything whatsoever to do with the confiscation of guns. There is nothing in this last chapter where I talk about after repeal and the ways in which we could adopt reasonable gun control. It has anything to do with confiscating guns. Do you really think people need weaponry capable of killing 9 people and wounding 17 in 36 seconds? What could you possibly need such a weapon for other than to kill as many people as rapidly and as efficiently as possible? In one of the most astounding things I've seen, and that's in my book, an NRA spokesman says, the AR-15, the most popular semi-automatic weapon that can, fire 40 or 50 bullets in less than a minute, it's just the musket of today. It's just the Brown Bess, they call it, of today. The musket of today? The musket fires one shot every 20 or 30 seconds. You have to reload it. You're likely to miss. It's likely to misfire. How in the world do you possibly compare that to a gun that can kill 9 people and wound 17 in 36 seconds? No one in America outside of the military needs a semi-automatic weapon. And they have magazines today that can hold up to 100 rounds. 30-round magazines are very common. So what would be the harm? And there would be great benefit from banning semi-automatic weapons and high-caliber, high-capacity magazines. Nobody needs them. Not for sport, not for self-defense, not for hunting. Completely unnecessary. Lots of states have permit laws where not just anyone can get a gun. You got to get a permit for a gun. You got to go through some rigorous checking. You got to take a gun safety course. Why not have permits universal? The states with permits are vastly safer from gun violence than states without permits. And of course, there is this huge loophole in the Brady Bill background check system, right? Where you can engage in private transactions and get any kind of firearm without any kind of background check. Plus, there's only a 5-day limit. So if the FBI, which it often doesn't make it in 5 days, no matter who you are, you can get a firearm. So why not have universal background checks? Why not extend the period for those checks? And we know although it's nowhere near the toll of gun suicides and gun murders, there are still a lot of gun accidents, particularly young children are often the victim of accidents. Why not have safe storage laws for firearms so they stay out of the reach of children or teenagers and you can't use them to create gun accidents? Why not have red flag laws that in extreme cases can take guns away from those who pose extreme dangers to the safety of their community? And there's another huge loophole that needs to be closed that you may never have heard of. Did you ever hear of ghost guns? There's such a thing called ghost guns because technology moves on, and we have something today called 3D printers. You heard of that? You can create all kinds of things with 3D printers. And guess what you can create? Guns. And the Trump administration reached a settlement on a lawsuit basically authorizing the production of 3D guns. They should be put under the same controls, with the same penalties as any other gun, and it should be forbidden under penalty of law for anyone to disseminate blueprints for ghost guns, which are also, by the way, untraceable, and you can't stop them in metal detectors either. They are an incredible danger for the future. And there are homemade guns. You can buy the component parts of an AR-15 even if you're a convicted felon and can't pass a background check. Just go on the internet. It's all over the net. You can buy the parts and do it yourself at home. And you know what else you can get on the internet? Remember the massacre in Las Vegas? Killed dozens of people. He used a mechanism called a bump stock to convert a semi-automatic weapon into an automatic weapon capable of firing hundreds of rounds a minute. Well, bump stocks are banned, but go on the internet. You can find all kinds of gun lobby sites which will teach you in 5 minutes how to convert a semi-automatic into an automatic weapon. Note, none of these reforms involve confiscating guns. None of them would impinge on the rights of hunters or collectors or people who could pass a permit check for self-defense. And by the way, all the data shows that the use of guns for violence is multiple times that of the incredibly rare use of guns for self-defense. I will close with a quotation from Ayala Eastman, a survivor of the horrific massacre at Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School in Florida. By the way, I think it was a parent of a girl who had been killed at this high school who shouted out a protest when Donald Trump started invoking the Second Amendment and was ejected. But here's what this incredible survivor said, who thought she was dead. And the only reason she didn't die was the boy in front of her died and fell on top of her and took the bullets. Imagine, that's going to haunt her for the rest of her life. And we need to listen to our young people. She said, the youth is urging our society to recognize the depth and seriousness of our gun violence epidemic in America. We are all here today with an urgent message to you. If youth across the country can fight to eradicate gun violence, why can't judges, lawmakers, and Donald Trump understand that young people are dying from this senseless violence? Doesn't have to be. That's why I wrote this book. Happy to take any and all of your questions. Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, hi. My understanding is the Second Amendment was passed because there was a fear by the early Americans of a standing army, and they wanted to be sure that the militias would be there. And it only had to do with the fear of a standing army because George III had a standing army. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
It's an excellent point. And it's in the book. The framers were very concerned about two things. Stability on the one hand, keeping their fledgling republic together and keeping it safe from internal rebellion or external invasion. So they needed some kind of armed force to deal with both of those. But they were also very fearful of tyranny. After all, they had just shed blood to break off the yoke of George III. And what they very much associated with tyranny was a standing army. That is, a professional army separate from the people. Now, they didn't entirely act on that because, as we know, the Constitution does give Congress the power to raise an army and a navy. But they believed that a much better alternative to the standing army to protect the country from internal and without is a well-regulated militia. And that was one of the reasons for the passage of the Second Amendment. That had nothing to do with individual self-defense. You're absolutely right. Yes, ma'am.
A well-regulated militia being necessary for the security of a free state seems to contemplate or even invite regulation and specify a state purpose. What kind of jurisprudence has written that away?
Great point. You're absolutely right. We had a wealth of state gun control laws dating back to the colonial period and extending well through the period shortly after the passage of the Second Amendment. None of it was struck down. Some of it was very strict, prohibiting even the carrying of firearms, whether concealed or not. And the first big jurisprudence that dealt directly with the Second Amendment dealt with the first federal gun control laws, the National Gun Control Act, passed in the 1930s. It was Miller versus U.S., and it was very clear. Second Amendment, you can regulate any kind of arms that didn't have to do with the formation of a well-regulated militia. Then we got Lewis versus the United States in 1980, which reaffirmed that the Second Amendment only protected arms insofar as they pertained to establishing a well-regulated militia. It was after that that the NRA promoted and financed a scholarship to change the views, and the first time that the Supreme Court recognized the Second Amendment as an individual right was an opinion written by Antonin Scalia in the famous Heller case involving guns in D.C., and that was a 5-4 decision. But I have a whole chapter on that. I'm not going to go into all of it. But what I thought was really interesting, Scalia is what we call an originalist, right? He believes in reconstructing the intent of framers. He didn't have anything from the framers. He had to go to all kinds of other documents to justify what he said. Thank you.
There is a doctrine of statutory construction called e justem generis, which provides that if you have words of a narrow purpose preceding words of a broader
Operative.
purpose,
Yep.
it is so narrowed for the broader purpose, and I don't know how that got blown away.
Ideology and lobbying. Yes, sir.
There's no doubt I'm stating the obvious when I say that there is bound to be an immense amount of blowback to the ideas you have put forth tonight.
I'm used to that.
Yes. I never meant to imply that you did not. However, it's bound to be, it's not bound to be one-dimensional. I'm sure plenty of it could be well thought out, but I feel a strong degree of certainty that much of it could be based around manipulative tactics to make your own arguments seem poorly presented, if not thought out, which I don't believe myself, by the way. But,
I have no doubt that's going to happen.
Well, it sounds like you're prepared for it. I would like to ask you how you intend to confront such tactics if you see them in any debate you choose to participate in.
Yes. Same way you saw me do it here. Facts, evidence, and argument. You know, I'm not here to make a political case against Donald Trump. That was another book. But You know, as professor, I've been a professor now for 46 years. One of the things I find most disturbing in the era of Trump is alternative facts, which they're blatant about. They say it. You know, as an historian, and I've got some of my students here, I teach my students. There are no alternative facts. There are only facts. You know, be careful in your research. Be careful in your evidence. Be careful in your reasoning, because facts matter. Analysis matters. Evidence matters. If we lose the truth, there's nothing left. We're in Orwell's 1984, so that's what I hope to stick to. And by the way, I just did an interview, a long podcast, in which I issued a call saying, anytime, any place, I am ready to debate any representative of the National Rifle Association. Thanks for the question.
You're welcome.
Yes, sir.
My question is, why do we have to repeal the Second Amendment? Can't we have ordinary laws, which we've had for 150 years, that took care of this problem, and we can go back to it. We can go back to it. Repealing an amendment takes a lot of states to concur, to pass a law.
3/4.
Congress, yes, if you get the Senate to go along.
Correct.
You can get a law passed pretty easily. What you're requiring is much harder, what you're speaking for is much harder to do than to pass ordinary legislation.
Got it. And in a sense, you're right. And if we had passed ordinary legislation in the past quarter century, I wouldn't be doing this. The fact is, we haven't. Not only has gun control hit a dead end, it slid backwards. You know, we had the lapse of the assault weapons ban. And by the way, I didn't talk about this, but it's in the book. The following year, in 2005, we had the Gun Manufacturers Shield Law, designed to shield gun manufacturers from misdeeds through, you know, misuse of their manufacturing and marketing. So absolutely, if I thought that the current strategy was working, I wouldn't write this book. But as I said, the game needs to be changed. We need a new strategy. We need a new inspirational one. And even if we don't succeed in repealing the amendment, we are going to send a shiver of fear right through the gun lobby. Yes, ma'am. Boy, you got a lot of books there.
Yeah.
I'm not going to sign them all.
I found your arguments, I find them very compelling. I have a quick question, but
Sure.
First a comment. I've been working several years on gun violence prevention. And
Thank you.
It really bothers me when we just talk about the deaths. So there were nearly 40,000 deaths in 2017. We know injuries are 2 to 3 times.
Correct. At least, and it's
So
in the book.
It's
I didn't
well
have time
over-
to talk about everything,
Okay,
but it's in the book.
Well over 100,000 Americans shot. Do you see a grassroots organization springing up around what you're
Yeah.
advocating?
The book just came out last week, so maybe a little premature. And I'm not a political activist. My wife is, Karen Strickler over there. She codified Roe versus Wade in the state of Maryland as head of Maryland NARAL, and is now saving the planet as head of VoteClimateUSA.PAC.
My comrades from Maryland NARAL is here in the second row there, Diane.
That's right, another hero from Maryland NARAL, Diane Pichet. So I'm not a political activist, but you know, one of the organizations that I thought was very militant and very promising was this New Moms organization. And by the way, one of the key organizations that led to the repeal of the Prohibition Amendment was Mothers for Repeal. That was the biggest repeal organization in America. So, you know, we men have so badly botched everything. I'm happy to leave it to the women. Hi.
Well, actually, that was pretty close to the question I was going to ask. So
Okay.
I don't want to just walk
You know,
away.
I'm
so-
a very clairvoyant. I knew your question.
Okay, well, I
Remember Johnny Carson, Carmack, you know?
Yeah, I was going to say, when you were going down the list of all the things that people supposedly don't need when it comes to guns, I could think of a right-wing or pro-gun response to all of them. So I was just going to ask how you could create cultural change to either change people's minds or marginalize the extremists, which has been ineffective so far. But
Well, people's minds are, to a great extent, changed. It's just that they haven't been channeled. You know, 80% want universal background checks. 70% want assault weapon bans. And that's been true for a long time. and it hasn't gone anywhere. And I am encouraged by a lot of things, by the way. For the first time ever, the gun control movement outspent the gun lobby in the midterm elections of 2018. The majority of new members of Congress are for gun control. But again, it isn't yielding anything. We need something more. Thank you. It can at the state level, absolutely, in blue states. But in the meantime, red states are going backwards.
Do you think it's inconsistent for liberals and progressives to suddenly embrace this original meaning view of the Constitution when previously their attitude towards the Constitution has been more activist and broader meaning, especially when it comes to the penumbras and the 14th Amendment?
Wow, you must be a lawyer. Yes, I guess that anyone who talks about penumbras, it's got to be an attorney. It's, of course, a great question. And my answer is, I'm not necessarily advocating any one or the other constitutional construction. I am taking on the gun lobby on their own grounds, to show on their own grounds, looking at the original meaning, they're wrong. If you want to take a broader constructionist view, they're even more wrong, because until 2010, we've had this whole robust, and even through 2000, this incredibly robust history of gun control that goes all the way back to the colonial period, a lot of which is very stringent.
Thank you.
Hey, Doug.
Hi, Alan. Which of the reforms you laid out in the last chapter would require repeal of the Second Amendment if they could simply be enacted by legislation?
Yeah. 2 points on that. One, I think I already talked about how hard it is with the play not to lose strategy to get legislation. But there's a second issue that I haven't had time to discuss, but I discuss in the book. Supreme Court. Just recently in California, the liberal, at least until now, Ninth Circuit struck down a high-capacity magazine law, saying it violates the new interpretation of the Second Amendment. And for the first time in many years, this even more conservative Supreme Court has taken on a new gun case, one coming out of New York. So whatever we pass, we have absolutely no guarantee it's going to survive legal challenge. The only way we can guarantee it'll survive legal challenge is to repeal the Second Amendment.
Hello, Dr. Lichtman.
Hey, good to see you.
See you too. I just had, I guess, one question, but sort of two parts. When I was reading...
Ask me one part at a time. I'm old,
okay.
and I can't remember things.
Okay. When I was reading the book, I didn't think about this later, but I was wondering, after the attempted assassination on President Andrew Jackson, the famous guy...
When the gun misfired, as was so typical in those days.
Was there any talk about sort of guns control during that time, or did it ever register?
There was. That was a very important time for gun controls. Probably the 19th century, the mid-19th century was the most fertile period for the adoption of gun controls across the states, not just in states where you would expect it, but southern states, Midwestern states, Wild West states. And by the way, it's in the book, but obviously I can't go over the whole book. Got to buy the book to get all the stuff. But, these Wild West towns like, Dodge City, and they all had gun controls. And you know why they had the gunfight at the OK Corral? Because the outlaw gang wouldn't obey the gun control laws. They wouldn't surrender their guns on coming in. And the cattle towns and railroad towns with gun controls had fewer murders than those that were wide open. Go ahead.
And the second one was also... I looked at when he was president of the NRA was President Grant, but I saw that 2 years before he became president was when President Garfield was assassinated. And I was wondering if he had said anything about guns when that happened, or if that had even been considered an issue.
I did not see anything from Grant about guns after the assassination of Garfield. But let me, riff off your comment, if I may. Because you're talking about the late 19th century. People don't realize, when the NRA was founded? 1871. by people like Ulysses Grant and other Civil War leaders. It was not founded to stop the proliferation of gun controls in the 19th century. You know what its purpose was? Marksmanship. And gun safety, exactly, because they saw, how many people were killed by accident, how terrible the marksmanship was in the Civil War. And it was a dying organization by the early 20th century. It was losing members, had no money, was unknown. If you look at the NRA today, they're not a single, everyone thinks they're a single issue organization. They're not. They are an all-purpose conservative organization attacking liberals and Democrats on every ground, including one of their big arguments is big government, right? All these handouts, all these people dependent on government. Well, the NRA was dying in the early 20th century. You know what saved it? Government. Government. We had the Dick Act. I'm not making that up. Anyone know what that act, I won't use the name again, what it established? National Guard. And as part of the National Guard, they set up the National Association for Marksmanship Practice. And that became a wholly owned subsidiary of the NRA, with government money and government supplies saving the NRA from a certain demise in the early 20th century. In fact, in the 1950s, the CEO of the NRA called the organization a semi-government organization. Government welfare to the NRA continued well into the 20th century and did not end until the 1970s. So great question about the origins of the NRA. That's extremely important.
Thank you, Dr. Lichtman.
Anyone else? Thank you for coming. I really appreciate this great audience. Thank you. And I'm happy to sign books. Remember, you only get a taste of it from this talk. You can't get it all.
Thank you very much for coming. If you're interested in purchasing